A woman has been murdered. Police are sure of that. But nothing else is what it appears to be. Investigators must sort out who's the victim and who's the killer. A father's greeting cards are no cause for joy when his daughter suspects he's not the man he pretends to be. To find the truth, detectives follow a paper trail through a maze of lies. A bungled murder and a twist of fate tip investigators off to a killer's elaborate scheme. But to win a conviction, they'll need his cooperation. Taking a life. Some killers take the phrase literally. After the kill, they assume their victims' lives, concealing their crime and hiding within their new stolen identity. Home to more than 1 million people, Detroit is Michigan's largest and toughest city. And like most metropolitan areas its size, it sees its share of crime. On May 4th, 1994, Betty Cole arrived at the Detroit Police Department to report her 32-year-old sister Annie missing. She said that Annie had left to run a quick errand with her boyfriend, Mo Jones, several hours earlier, but hadn't returned. Jones was allegedly involved in drugs, and Betty was worried that something bad had happened to her sister. But police policy requires at least 24 hours before a missing persons investigation can be opened. Betty would have to wait.
Why don't you go home? She's probably there asleep.
Though upset, she returned home, hopeful that her sister would soon turn up. The following morning, an anonymous 911 call brought police to an abandoned warehouse. When they arrived, Betty Cole and members of her family were waiting outside. Betty had also received an anonymous call from a man who claimed that her sister Annie was inside. Officers made their way into the building. At the end of a corridor, they found the lifeless body of a young woman. She had been shot 3 times in the head. Police returned outside and asked Betty to identify the body. When she saw the victim, she broke down. She confirmed that it was her sister, Annie Cole. Forensics technicians began processing the scene. Near the body, they collected 3 spent small caliber shells. They also found a purse nearby, but it contained no cash, credit cards, or any form of identification. The bullets recovered from the victim were sent to the Detroit Forensic Services lab. There, Sergeant Paul Hartzell analyzed the slugs and the recovered shell casings using a digital micrometer.
The micrometer is a tool that we can use to help us determine caliber of a bullet, or to help us determine a probable make of a particular bullet. This is done by mounting the bullet either with the base up, so we can measure the diameter of the bullet to help us determine caliber, or we can actually measure the lands and grooves on the bullet to help us determine a probable make of a weapon that may have fired that bullet.
Each brand of gun creates its own characteristic pattern on a slug. And every individual firearm leaves unique marks on a bullet, like the gun's fingerprint. Analysis of the markings on the 3 slugs recovered from the victim led examiners to conclude that it was one gun, a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that had been used to commit the murder, indicating a lone triggerman. Sergeant Patrick Hennahan of the Detroit Police Department began his investigation by looking for the last person reported to have been with Annie Cole. Her boyfriend, Mo Jones.
Trying to identify him and find out where he might be.
We weren't able to develop any information on a Mo Jones. We searched, department arrest records, narcotics bureau records, things of that nature. We weren't able to come up with anything.
While the search for the mysterious Mo Jones was underway, investigators tried to learn as much as they could about Annie Cole. The victim's fingerprints recovered from the crime scene were entered into the police database containing fingerprint records. After an extensive search, the database turned up no matches. Annie Cole had apparently stayed out of trouble until this terrible day.
That's all you know is it's on Finfor.
Unable to locate the victim's boyfriend, Detective Hennahan relied on Betty Cole for information. But after a few days, it seemed she had disappeared.
I made another attempt after the weekend to contact her, and it was almost as if she had fallen off the face of the earth all of a sudden.
Pat, why don't you take a look at this?
With no clear leads in sight, he enlisted the aid of homicide detective Monica Childs.
We received from the
Her initial investigation revealed some troubling inconsistencies.
fingerprinted, identified as Annie.
Though the victim's prints were not on file with the police department, a records check revealed an extensive felony record under the name of Annie Cole.
That's Annie Cole.
Yeah, and I don't think
In fact, a warrant was currently out for her arrest on a probation violation. Trying to resolve the conflicting information, examiners compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those contained in Annie Cole's criminal records. They didn't match. Annie Cole and the victim found at the warehouse were not the same person. And though there were several people named Annie Cole living in the Detroit metropolitan area, the victim and the known criminal shared a common address. Looking for answers, police went to the funeral home where the victim's body was being kept.
Could you give me some information on the Cole case?
There, the director stated that Betty Cole had been in 4 days earlier to request a speedy cremation for her sister.
She was in here 4 days ago.
Betty had stressed that there wasn't to be a service.
Yeah, well, it's strange when she knows there's an ongoing investigation.
The cremation was scheduled for the following day. For Detective Monica Childs, the arrangements made no sense.
Due to the age of the victim and me being an African American, I know culturally we have a service, okay? If there's no body, we have a memorial service. Even if the person is cremated, there's a service. And Pat and I talked about it. He said, that doesn't sound right. That sounds a little odd. I said, that is very unusual.
Here's some of the crime scene.
Investigators' strongest clue in this unusual case lay in a casket that was about to be incinerated.
She doesn't have her shoes on, but the shoes are there.
They obtained a court order to postpone the cremation. To sort things out, police needed to find Betty Cole, the woman who claimed to be the victim's sister. At the address Betty had given as her own, investigators were met by a man named James Shaver. He said he was Annie Cole's brother. He stated it was impossible that Annie had been murdered a week ago. He had just seen her the day before, leaving on a trip to Mississippi. he had never heard of Betty Cole. He agreed to accompany police to the funeral home to try to identify the body. Shaver viewed the body with a total lack of recognition.
I don't know who this woman is. This is not my sister, though.
This woman, whoever she was not his sister, Annie. If anyone could identify the nameless victim found in the warehouse, it was the fictitious Betty Cole, who was nowhere to be found. For investigators, it was clear that she was deeply involved in this deadly charade. Detroit police struggled to make sense of a bizarre murder investigation. Forensic evidence proved that the young female victim thought to be Annie Cole was misidentified, and the woman who had ID'd her was now missing.
You've only talked to her over the phone. You've never seen
Hoping to give a name to the victim found shot to death in the warehouse, police scoured recent missing persons reports. One matched their victim.
You have a boyfriend?
Quinetta and Roy Spruill had reported their 28-year-old niece Stella missing on May 4th, the day before the body was found. Stella's co-workers had called the Spruills looking for her. The employees said that when Stella left for lunch that day, she was going to meet someone, though she never said who. She seemed upbeat. But when Stella failed to return, they began to worry. The day after Stella's disappearance, a department store clerk called the Spruills looking for their niece. Stella had just applied for a credit card, and the store needed to verify some information on her application. The Spruills couldn't imagine that Stella would just take off without a word.
Stella Spruill, from what we learned from the family, was a religious young lady, a loyal friend, just an all-around good person.
Police asked the Spruills to view the body found at the warehouse, which had since been returned to the medical examiner's office. The victim was their niece, Stella Spruill. Now, police had to figure out who had murdered her and why. Detectives contacted the department store where Stella had allegedly filled out the credit card application. A surveillance camera had captured the transaction. Detectives recognized the woman in the video, and it wasn't Stella Spruill. It was the person who had identified herself as Betty Cole, the victim's sister, at the crime scene. Now, she was on tape impersonating Stella. And though investigators were convinced that the woman in the video was the real Annie Cole, they still had to determine how she was connected to Stella Spruill. Hoping to find an answer, they went to Stella's workplace. Employees there recognized the woman from the tape. Her name, they said, was Annie Cole. She used to work there with Stella, and the two were friends. For investigators, there was little doubt that Annie Cole was behind the murder of Stella Spruill. Now they needed proof. Police turned to Annie Cole's family for help. Annie's brother and one of her daughters were brought in for questioning. Police believed they might be able to identify the male voice on the anonymous 911 call that brought police to the warehouse where the victim's body was discovered. James Shaver didn't recognize the voice. But Annie Cole's daughter believed she did.
While listening to the copy of the 911 tape, the one daughter said, "Well, that's my cousin Leander."
Annie Cole's 17-year-old nephew, Leander Foster, was brought in for questioning. Police recognized him as being with the fictitious Betty Cole at the warehouse when the body was discovered.
Annie Cole.
Foster, who had no criminal record, broke down under questioning.
Asked me to help her out.
He admitted that Annie had promised him and his best friend $5,000 each to kill Stella Spruill.
She didn't want to go to jail, so
The day before the murder, Annie arranged to meet Stella at a mall parking lot. Leander and his partner were nearby, getting a look at their intended victim.
So, I mean, she showed us where she hangs out.
The
where
next
she
day,
normally
when
goes.
Stella arrived on her lunch hour to meet Annie again,
Parking lot.
Leander Foster and his friend were waiting.
Oh, I'm Leander Foster.
They abducted her at gunpoint, forced her inside the car, and took her to the abandoned warehouse.
Get in that room right there.
There, Foster said he shot her 3 times with a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson that Annie had given him for the job. They cleaned out her purse and gave Stella's ID to Annie.
Warehouse, and we
The next day, after Annie Cole filed the false missing persons report, Leander called the police to report the body.
This is Annie's idea. This is all Annie's idea. So
He didn't
we
know what
got
happened
her-
to the murder
got the
weapon.
ID that she wanted.
On May 11, 1994, a week after Stella Spruill was murdered, Annie Cole was tracked down at a relative's house in Indianola, Mississippi. She was arrested and taken back to Detroit for questioning. But police had already pieced together the motive behind Annie Cole's deadly scheme.
Annie Cole was probably a consummate con person. She was aware of outstanding warrants for her arrest and made a calculated decision that she didn't want to go back to prison. Based on her interviews with co-defendants and witnesses, she set in place a plan to assume another person's identity and disappear into the sunset, if you will, and live happily ever after.
To fake her own death, Annie needed a real victim, but she had no one in mind.
Run that back by me, then we come out.
The victim found her.
Yeah, this week has been good.
Stella Spruill called her former co-worker to invite her to a makeup demonstration. Annie declined, but realized in that instant who her victim was going to be. Trusting, hard-working Stella Spruill.
Bye.
Annie Cole was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Leander Foster also received a life sentence. The other accomplice pled guilty to manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Some people kill to purify their reputations. Others are motivated by pure greed. Bonner County, Idaho lies nestled between Washington State to the west and Montana to the east.
Here you go, Ted.
But in 1994, it found itself in the middle of a mystery. In late February, Shelley Kepley arrived at the Bonner County Sheriff's Office.
And everything seemed to be in order. What's his name?
She had flown in from Reno, Nevada to check on her father, Paul Gruber, who lived in the area.
Like perhaps he decided to take off.
No,
she suspected that something was terribly wrong. Shelley said she'd last seen her father a month earlier when he'd come to Reno for the holidays. At age 54, he was independently wealthy as a result of good investments and had recently retired from teaching school. He'd been living in Idaho for about 6 months and seemed happy there. But over the past month or so, Shelley and her son had received several greeting cards and cash gifts from her father. But the signature on the cards didn't really look like his writing. And her repeated phone calls to him went unanswered. If he had gone on a trip, he would have told her his plans. Believing that someone may be impersonating her dad, Shelley didn't know where else to turn. Investigators forwarded the documents to the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. There, examiners compared Gruber's known writing samples with the signatures on the greeting cards. But there wasn't enough to work with, and examiners could not exclude Paul Gruber as the person who signed the cards. Though police had no evidence of foul play, they agreed to look into the matter. Under the circumstances, Shelley had been given power of attorney over her father's estate. She gave police permission to search his property. Lieutenant Harvey Thompson went to Gruber's house to look around. Shelley had told him that her father kept his financial records and an inventory of his possessions in a locked box hidden in the crawl space. Lieutenant Thompson went there to recover it.
There was an inventory in it. There were titles to vehicles in it. There was a little bit of jewelry in it and insurance papers.
With the inventory now in hand, investigators made their way through the house.
Empty.
Plastic sheets covering the furniture suggested that Gruber had gone away for an extended period of time. It soon became apparent that several items on the list were nowhere to be found. And they were not the type of things one packs simply to go on a trip.
I found out about guns being missing. I found out computer equipment that should have been there was gone. A gun safe was gone. Just a lot of stuff was gone.
It seemed Shelley Kepley's concerns about her missing father were well-founded. And though there was no physical evidence to support it, police were now starting to believe that harm had come to Paul Gruber. Police in Bonner County, Idaho, continued searching for clues in the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. And though no one had heard from him in some time, his accounts were still active. While scouring financial records obtained from Gruber's bank, Lieutenant Thompson found something suspicious. Paul Gruber had been paying someone else's mortgage. And from what police had learned, that seemed completely out of character.
From talking to Shelley Kepley, Mr. Gruber's daughter, Mr. Gruber didn't pay other people's mortgages. He didn't loan other people his vehicles. You know, what's Mr. Gruber's pretty well stays Mr. Gruber's.
Darrell Kuehl, the man whose mortgage was being paid for by Gruber, was brought in for questioning. He told police he was a general contractor who had done extensive work at Gruber's house. He said he was starting a new home security business and other ventures that Paul Gruber had decided to invest in. Rather than investing cash, however, Gruber had agreed to make payments to Kuehl's mortgage company. To investigators, that arrangement didn't sound like something Shelley Kepley's father would agree to. To be certain they were talking about the same person, police showed Kuehl a photograph of Paul Gruber. But Kuehl didn't recognize him. That wasn't the man he knew. Someone else, it seemed, was trying to pass himself off as Paul Gruber.
This is Tony, I'm sketch artist. Now you tell him.
Investigators asked him to describe the man who hired him to a police sketch artist. If police were to have any hope of finding the missing Paul Gruber, they would first have to identify the imposter.
Sir, can I talk to you a moment?
Armed with the sketch, police canvassed Gruber's neighborhood,
Bonner County Police. I was wondering,
but nobody recognized the face.
I don't know. I've never seen a guy in the neighborhood around here.
And no one had seen Gruber for some time. As the race to put a name to the face in the sketch intensified, investigators got a break. The manager of the local post office had heard of the disappearance and informed police that Paul Gruber's mail was still being picked up from his P.O. box.
yeah, sure. Listen, do me a favor.
He turned over a tape from a security camera that was located near Gruber's box. The video revealed 3 men at different times in the vicinity of Gruber's P.O. box. One of them, partially obscured and in profile, looked familiar.
One of the mails that was at Mr. Gruber's box during the period of time appeared to be that of Darrell Kuehl.
Suddenly, the investigation's best witness was becoming the prime suspect. Though the image on the video was not conclusive, it was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Kuehl's property. Inside his home, they found a variety of tools, electronic equipment, and other items that were similar to those missing from Paul Gruber's residence. Darrell Kuehl insisted the things belonged to him. But detectives discovered that some of the items had serial numbers matching the inventory from Gruber's safe. Though police suspected Kuehl had killed Gruber and then assumed his identity in order to cash in on his victim's wealth, they found nothing to support a murder charge.
I had enough probable cause to arrest him for maybe theft and possibly forgery, but we didn't have a body. I couldn't prove that anything had actually happened to Mr. Gruber.
Feeling something may have been overlooked, Lieutenant Thompson ordered another search of Gruber's home. One of the investigators had found a strange depression in the crawl space, and the excavation team began digging beneath the house. They kept at it for hours, but with no luck. Then, about 2 feet down, they were overcome by the unmistakable smell of a decomposing body. Police in northern Idaho were getting closer to solving the mysterious disappearance of 54-year-old Paul Gruber. Digging in the crawl space of Gruber's home, police believed they had finally found him.
We went under the house and about 2.5 feet down found a white plastic trash bag, took it out, and found several pairs of glasses and glass case in it. Also a distinct odor of a deteriorating body.
17 months after being reported missing by his daughter, Paul Gruber's body was found, wrapped in an air mattress and buried beneath his own house. He had been shot 6 times. Police theorized that Paul Gruber had been killed in order to clear the way for someone to steal his identity and access his wealth. Investigators believed that someone was Darrell Kuehl. Now they had to prove it. And the best way to do that was to physically link him to the scheme to steal Gruber's identity. The greeting cards that Gruber's daughter received, allegedly from her father, were sent to the lab for DNA analysis. Examiners removed the stamps from the envelopes, hoping to find DNA from the person who mailed them. But according to Carla Finnis of the Idaho Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab, finding usable DNA samples on the back of a stamp was a long shot.
When you're talking about a stamp or an envelope, the cellular material comes from cells that have been sloughed off into the saliva from the cheeks and the tongue of the individual who licks the stamp or envelope. One can imagine that that's considerably less DNA than one would find in a normal blood sample.
Still, examiners were able to isolate and extract a single minute trace of saliva. The sample was enough for a DNA profile to be developed. Now, they needed a source of comparison. Despite his protestations of innocence, Darrell Kuehl was arrested for suspicion of murdering Paul Gruber. Once in custody, police wasted no time obtaining a blood sample. The evidence was sent back to the crime lab. Examiners generated a DNA profile of Darrell Kuehl. The results were then compared to the profile generated from the stamp. The conclusion was indisputable. Darrell Kuehl had licked those stamps. Police had made their case. From what investigators could determine, Kuehl had a history of shady business schemes. He saw his employer, the wealthy, retired Paul Gruber, as an easy mark. But Gruber must have seen through the scams, refusing to be taken in. Kuehl then came up with another plan to get to his money. He would become Paul Gruber. Darrell Kuehl was found guilty of first-degree murder, grand theft, and forgery. He received 25 years for murder and 25 years for theft. A daughter's diligence made it hard for Kuehl to maintain his charade. But some predators rely on the vulnerability and isolation of their victims to work their schemes. On August 15, 1997, state police were dispatched to the home of 56-year-old Thomas Wayne Jones in Milford, Delaware. When Jones's home care nurse arrived for work, she found traces of blood on the floor. The house had been ransacked. Valuable coins and several financial records appeared to be missing. Her employer, who was confined to a wheelchair, was nowhere to be found.
Some firearms, and we're gonna need to take some prints. I'm gonna need a print kit.
Outside, police combed the grounds for any clues to Jones's whereabouts. One of the officers followed faint tire tracks that disappeared into a field. They led him 500 yards from the house and directly to the body of Thomas Wayne Jones. He had been shot in the back of the neck, but was still alive. Emergency personnel rushed to the scene. The wealthy entrepreneur was in critical condition, but still conscious. He managed to tell police the identity of his attacker, a longtime friend named George Calamaris. Jones said that after being shot, Calamaris placed him in a white pickup truck and dumped him in the field. A warrant was issued for Calamaris' arrest. Records indicated that Calamaris was living across the Delaware border in Silver Spring, Maryland. There, officers from the Montgomery County Police Department were asked to bring in the suspect in the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones. But when police went to pick Calamaris up, he wasn't home. Calamaris' wife, Noreen, stated that she had not heard from her husband in a few days. But she agreed to contact the police if and when she heard from him. Police were skeptical that Calamaris' wife would actually turn him in. But a few hours later, Montgomery County Detective Terry Ryan received a call.
Mrs. Calamaris notified the police once she was contacted by George Calamaris. He was living in a wooded area, essentially on the lam, close to the home, and he contacted her in an effort to get some money and clothing.
Mrs. Calamaris told police that her husband was on his way to a nearby convenience store to buy supplies. When he exited the store, police were waiting. They moved in and made the arrest. He was transported to the Maryland Detention Center and booked for the attempted murder of Thomas Wayne Jones. Calamaris admitted he was friends with Jones. Having recently returned to the area after living in North Carolina, Calamaris had gone to visit Jones that morning. He strongly denied any knowledge of the attack. Though investigators suspected that Calamaris was lying, they had no obvious motive and no hard evidence linking him to the crime. Believing Calamaris' truck used to transport the victim into the field would yield valuable clues, police spent the next few months trying to track it down. But its whereabouts remained unknown. Then they got a tip. An anonymous caller told police that the pickup truck could be found at a machine shop in nearby Dickerson, Maryland, owned by one of Calamaris' friends. But when they arrived, investigators saw no sign of the truck. The shop owner denied any knowledge of the vehicle, though he admitted he was friends with George Calamaris. The lead appeared to be a waste of time, until a bundle of mail caught the detective's eye. The name on the letters bore a striking similarity to the name of the shooting victim in Delaware.
It was several pieces of mail from a bank in North Carolina addressed to a person named Gary Wayne Thomas. We knew that this similarity in names, our Delaware victim, Thomas Wayne Jones, was probably more than a coincidence. In fact, at the point we expected it was probably some alias that Calamaris had contrived from the Jones case.
The shop owner claimed that he didn't know who Gary Wayne Thomas was. He said Thomas's mail arrived there and George Calamaris picked it up. And now that Calamaris was in prison awaiting extradition to Delaware, his wife collected it. Unsure if this clue was related to the shooting of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, Montgomery County Detective Joe Montano contacted the North Carolina bank to see if there really was a client by the name of Gary Wayne Thomas.
Open the same bank.
Thomas Wayne Jones.
They said, yes, there was. And I said, well, can you describe him to me? And I fully expected them to describe the way George Calamaris looks. And they described somebody completely different. And I asked, well, when is the last time you saw Gary Wayne Thomas? And the bank said, well, come to think of it, probably 1996, the middle of 96. And this was over a year later.
According to bank records, Gary Wayne Thomas was worth millions, and no one had seen him in over a year.
I see they continue.
As police struggled to figure out the connection, word came in that Thomas Wayne Jones died as a result of his injuries from the shooting attack. Now, police shifted their focus to building a murder case against their suspect, George Calamaris. While police struggled to link George Calamaris to the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, their investigation uncovered a strange clue. Calamaris was receiving mail from a bank in North Carolina for a man named Gary Wayne Thomas. Unsure who this person was or how he was connected to George Calamaris, authorities contacted police in North Carolina. Detective Ricky Best of the Greenville Police Department was asked to pursue the lead.
They were asking me to check at a certain location here in Greenville to try to locate Gary Wayne Thomas. That they were investigating a murder case themselves, and they wanted to find out if Gary Wayne Thomas existed.
Detective Best began by speaking to the manager of the bank where the letters to Gary Wayne Thomas originated. She confirmed that Thomas was indeed a real person, and he was living off the interest of a trust fund worth more than $1 million. His account was still active, and money was being withdrawn regularly. But over the past year, he communicated solely through letters and rare phone calls. Looking for answers, Greenville police contacted Thomas's family. His father confirmed that he had set up the trust fund for his son. He said Gary was a troubled young man who battled drug and alcohol dependency. Worried about his son's well-being, he instructed the family attorney to draw up the trust. He hoped the fund would limit the amount of money Gary could access to purchase drugs and alcohol. But the arrangement had caused friction, and Mr. Thomas had little contact with Gary after that. In fact, he hadn't heard from his son in over a year. The information put investigators no closer to establishing the connection between Gary Wayne Thomas and George Calamaris. They needed to find Thomas. Hoping to track him down, police contacted the apartment manager of his last known address.
She said that Gary Wayne Thomas disappeared sometime around June or the first part of July of 1996. That she thought it to be odd because he left all of his belongings there in the apartment. But one of Gary's friends, she referred to him as George Calamaris, told her that Gary was away in Maryland.
Police had established that George Calamaris and Gary Wayne Thomas had lived in the same apartment complex in North Carolina and were friends. Now, the wealthy Gary Wayne Thomas was missing. The information was passed on to the Maryland detectives. Police now feared that Gary Wayne Thomas had met the same fate as Thomas Wayne Jones in Delaware, that he had been murdered in an attempt to get at his money. but they had no proof that anything had actually happened to Gary Wayne Thomas. In fact, money was still being withdrawn from Thomas's account through a bank in Silver Spring, Maryland. But it couldn't be Calamaris making the withdrawals. He was in prison.
Well, we asked the bank to please keep the account open. Don't close it. Allow the withdrawals to continue so we could start tracing them. And when we did that, we immediately, from the codes, from the transaction codes, we could find out what bank the money was being withdrawn from in Maryland, obtained the bank film, and the first film we obtained, the person obtaining the money was Noreen Calamaris, George's wife.
Noreen Calamaris, who had been cooperative since early in the investigation, was arrested for bank fraud and money laundering. A subsequent search of the Calamaris home uncovered Gary Wayne Thomas's ATM card and some unmailed letters allegedly signed by him asking his bank to increase his monthly allowance. Noreen told police that after her husband was arrested, their friend at the machine shop started bringing over Thomas's mail. It included bank statements, the ATM card, and blank checks. She said that her husband told her that Thomas had given them permission to use the items. Noreen hadn't seen or heard from Thomas since she left North Carolina with George Calamaris several months earlier. The information prompted investigators to search Calamaris's jail cell. Several typewritten letters ready to be mailed to the bank in North Carolina, signed Gary Wayne Thomas, were confiscated. Because the U.S. mail was being used to perpetuate the crimes, the evidence was forwarded to the U.S. Postal Inspection Service Crime Lab in New York. There, Forensic Sciences manager John Schatz compared handwriting from the documents found in Calamaris's house and jail cell against known samples of Gary Wayne Thomas.
We know that we never write exactly the same way. If we have writings that is exactly the same, it's usually an indication that it is a trace forgery or another type of photocopy that has been reproduced and the document has been altered. But in many cases, what we do is we compare the idiosyncratic movement, we make a comparison of the similar motions and dissimilar motions, and then we become a determination if they're written by the same author.
Besides the shape and slant of the letters, analysts also look for the pressure on the page and places where a forger paused to consciously form his letters a certain way. These pen lifts can be a tip-off to a forgery.
When we made those comparisons, we were able to determine that Mr. Calamaris was the author of the Gary Thomas signatures on the typewritten letters.
Unable to dodge the evidence, Calamaris knew his run was over. To avoid the death penalty, he confessed to his crimes. He told investigators that he had been friends with Gary Wayne Thomas, but soon became jealous of his wealth. He plotted to kill him and take over his life, or at least his trust fund. In July 1996, Calamaris offered to show Thomas some marijuana plants he said he was growing in a field near the apartments. But when they drove out there, Calamaris shot Thomas dead. He left him in the woods, then later returned to scatter the remains so they would never be found. The crime went undetected for almost 3 years. Financially, It had worked out well for Calamares, but it wasn't enough. Soon after returning to Maryland, he began devising another scheme. He would kill his friend, Thomas Wayne Jones, assume his identity, and cash in on his victim's wealth. The plan backfired, however, when Jones lived long enough to identify his attacker. For his crimes, George Calamares received 395 years for the federal crime of bank fraud, life in prison for the murder of Thomas Wayne Jones, and 45 years for the murder of Gary Wayne Thomas. Noreen Calamares received 6 months of house arrest for money laundering and mail fraud. For some murderers, taking a life is not enough. They want to become their victims. The result is an ongoing deception that's difficult to maintain. Each day increases the chances that a killer will be exposed, hiding behind a stolen identity. A young mother is found murdered near her Indiana home. Investigators have only one piece of evidence to help them find her killer. When a female body is discovered along the banks of an Alabama river, detectives must rely on a few tiny shreds of evidence to make their case. In New York, a woman is found dead at the bottom of a flight of stairs. Police must determine if her death is a suicide or murder. When there are no eyewitnesses to a murder, investigators look to the physical evidence to make their case. Forensic examiners seek out that one clue that can break a case wide open, a clue known as the silent witness. Named for the river flowing through its center, Elkhart, Indiana epitomizes the ideal of small-town America. It's a quiet, close-knit community, a place unfamiliar with the problems of violent crime. On March 3, 1992, a concerned father entered the Elkhart Police Department to file a missing persons report.
My daughter, her name is
Ruben Hernandez hadn't heard from his daughter in nearly 15 hours. 25-year-old Sandra Hernandez had dropped off her 3-year-old son around 5 p.m. the previous evening. Ruben believed that Sandra had a date that night. After saying her goodbyes, Sandra promised she would be back in a couple of hours to pick him up.
Okay.
Ruben and his wife were always happy to spend time with their only grandson, and they were glad to see that Sandra was starting to enjoy her life again. She had recently ended a turbulent 4-year relationship with her child's possessive father. Ruben explained that when he went to check on Sandra at her apartment, he got no response, though her car was still parked out front.
One particular guy that's been giving her a hard time.
Mr. Hernandez's concerns prompted Elkhart Police Lieutenant Tom Cutler to forego the 24-hour waiting period required before opening a missing persons investigation.
He's a fellow who was very concerned about not only his grandchild who he was taking care of, but also his missing daughter. And he knew that she wouldn't take off and leave the child without touching base with him.
After distributing Sandra's description to area law enforcement agencies, police quickly contacted her ex-boyfriend.
Did you guys argue?
Sean Parks strongly denied any knowledge of Sandra's disappearance.
Stuff about the kid, you know.
Why would you bring up something really like when I worked?
But he admitted that his 4-year relationship with her had been rocky. He said that recently he and Sandra had been arguing frequently and sometimes violently. Mostly, they fought over custody of their son. Sandra vowed she would never give up her child.
What did you guys talk
But despite the tensions, Parks insisted he would never hurt Sandra or their son.
Confrontation with Sandra. What were you doing Sunday night?
On the night Sandra disappeared, he claimed he was at work.
Friends. Okay. With some friends. Okay.
Though Parks was cooperative, investigators know from experience that custody battles can sometimes end in murder.
We checked with work and he was there all night and didn't leave the premise. So we had no reason to believe that he had interacted with Sandra Hernandez on that night.
With the only obvious suspect eliminated, investigators had to consider that Sandra might have left town on her own volition. And though that seemed unlikely, they had to be certain. They went to her residence to search for answers. What they found only supported their suspicions that the young mother had met with foul play. None of Sandra's clothes seemed to be missing, and her luggage was still neatly stored in her closet.
Hey, Jim.
In the kitchen, detectives found a container filled with $230 in cash.
Driver's license.
Sandra's driver's license was also in the tin, with several other personal papers. Police saw no evidence to suggest that she had simply packed up and left town.
I don't think she was going anywhere.
Her neighbors later stated that they had not seen or heard Sandra at her apartment since she left to drop off her son the night she disappeared. With each passing hour, investigators realized that the chances of finding Sandra unharmed grew slimmer. They needed to determine if Sandra had in fact been on a date the night she disappeared, and if so, with whom. Sandra's friend, who worked with her at a door manufacturing company, came in to answer questions. She hadn't noticed anything unusual about Sandra's demeanor in recent days.
How long has he been with the company?
In fact, the night she disappeared, Sandra was excited about a date she was going on with a coworker.
Pushing the issue for quite a while.
The man, Ricky Joyner, was a delivery driver at the company.
Right.
And had been friends with Sandra for some time. When contacted by police, Joyner volunteered to come answer questions. Investigators immediately noticed fresh scratches on his face and hands. Joyner claimed a door falling on him at work caused the injuries. He admitted that he had been out with Sandra the night she disappeared, but only as friends. He said he picked her up at 6 p.m. They had dinner and then went to a movie that lasted about 2 hours.
Are you ready to drive? Do I lie?
He dropped her off around 9:30. Sandra was in a hurry to pick up her son. He watched her get into her car and leave. He hadn't seen or heard from Sandra since.
Thank you.
All right. Look right at me.
Investigators asked Joyner to fill out a scientific content analysis form, referred to as a SCAN questionnaire. Like a polygraph, the questionnaire allows investigators to analyze a person's written responses for signs of deception or inconsistencies.
The SCAN questionnaire is a written form that we give people that ask people pointed questions and ask them to respond in their own writing. So it gives us a way to do an informal interview that sometimes reveals a lot about the information that the person's given.
Investigators analyzed Joyner's statements. Using the information to reconstruct Sandra's movements prior to her disappearance, Lieutenant Cutler quickly found a troubling inconsistency.
Part of his statement was that he had let her off at the apartment and she'd gotten into her car and left. Well, her car was still there, and the neighbors said no, nobody came there that night. So that leads us to believe that that part of the story was not true.
Though police had no motive and no direct evidence that a crime had been committed, they obtained a warrant to search Joyner's residence. But the search turned up nothing. Investigators knew they needed to look past the obvious. They collected ordinary household items, including a trash bag from Joyner's kitchen dotted with stains that appeared to be blood. Tests later showed, however, that the substance was not of human origin. Having found no hard evidence linking Joyner to Sandra's disappearance, the investigation threatened to go cold.
Canvases of where she lives. Well, certainly they're looking grim. Unfortunately, we still don't know how to assess them. We suspect that some foul plays happened. We've seen cases where people take off and vanish for reasons that nobody knows about, and they come back. We were certainly concerned that this was not a good situation and that we were going to find her dead.
On April 15, 1992, a month and a half after Sandra Hernandez was reported missing, their worst fears were confirmed. A farmer in nearby LaGrange County, Indiana, made a gruesome discovery: the body of a young woman.
1023 the location.
Okay, Claire, we're just a couple minutes away.
As investigators in Elkhart, Indiana continued searching for 25-year-old Sandra Hernandez, they received a call from police in nearby LaGrange County. A body matching Sandra's description had been found in an isolated field. A black trash bag covering the victim's head was removed and preserved as evidence. Using photographs, investigators confirmed that Sandra Hernandez had finally been found. Police began scouring the scene for any useful evidence, but nothing that could help them identify a suspect was found. After an exhaustive search of the area, it appeared that Sandra's killer had been careful not to leave any trace of evidence behind. At autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Sandra had died of asphyxiation, resulting from manual strangulation. An analysis of the victim's stomach contents indicated that she had been murdered within an hour after eating. The medical examiner's analysis made Ricky Joyner's alibi impossible.
Doris Plus say she's great. She
Sandra could not have gone to a 2-hour movie after eating dinner with Joyner, as he had previously claimed.
Has anybody been in their house yet?
But to prove murder, investigators knew they needed more than a few inconsistencies in Joyner's story. They had to come up with hard evidence to tie Joyner to the crime scene. But all they had was the trash bag recovered from Joyner's apartment.
The trash bag turns out to have the most significance of anything that's taken. The trash bag that's found on the corpse, when the state police tech decide to look at the evidence, send it to the lab, they talk to our techs, and they decide, hey, we've got this bag from Joyner, the suspect's apartment. Let's send it to the lab with the bag we found on the corpse, just to have them look at it.
The bags were sent to forensic examiner John Vanderkolk at the Indiana State Police Crime Lab. Though it seemed like a long shot, Vanderkolk was asked to determine if the bag recovered from the victim and the bag seized from Joyner's apartment could have come from the same piece of plastic. To begin his analysis, Vanderkolk began by looking for repeatable class characteristics.
The repeatable class characteristics would be the cutting tool that would use to cut the bags apart, the size and shape of the bag, the general color of the bag, the dimensions of the bag, and any feature of the bag that can be repeated by the manufacturing process.
By shining a light through the evidence, Vanderkolk determined that random color variations, microscopic impurities, and stretch marks were consistent between the bags. He continued his analysis by comparing the bags end to end. Vanderkolk found that the unique tool marks made as the bags were separated during manufacturing corresponded between the top of one of the bags and the bottom of the other. He was certain that the two bags had originated from the same piece of plastic, and in fact, they had come from the same roll.
I was convinced by the random pigment variation that carried over from one bag to the other, and also the random impurities and the stretch marks generated off the impurities that carried over from one bag to the other directly across the cut separation. The randomness definitely carried over throughout the circumference of the bottom of the bag from Sandra Hernandez's head and the top of the bag that Elkhart Police Department had recovered from Ricky Joyner's house.
With no way to explain how a trash bag from his apartment ended up around the victim's head, Ricky Joyner was arrested and charged with the murder of Sandra Hernandez. Police surmised that after going out to dinner together, Sandra went with Joyner to his residence. But something went wrong. After a violent struggle, Joyner strangled Sandra to death. Police theorized that before putting her body into his car, he covered Sandra's head with a trash bag to keep traces of blood from being left behind. He then drove his victim to nearby LaGrange County. He placed her in the isolated field and left her there. After extensive legal proceedings, a jury found Ricky Joyner guilty of the murder of Sandra Hernandez. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Ricky Joyner believed that an ordinary trash bag would cover up his crime. Other killers will go to even greater lengths to conceal their guilt. Nestled in the Tennessee River Valley, the city of Decatur, Alabama clings to a rich and colorful past. Its laid-back southern charm and its reputation as a fishing haven attract thousands of sportsmen each year. But in 1988, the river attracted a different kind of visitor. On July 5th, a fisherman called Decatur police after stumbling upon a body dressed in a nightgown and a blue pajama top near the shoreline. Police could determine that the body was female, but little else. The victim had been decapitated. After securing the area, investigators began the task of processing the scene for clues that could tell them who this victim was. They knew that because she had been decapitated, her identity would be the key to exposing this killer. The crime scene had little to offer. Blood-spattered rocks on the path and drag marks in the overgrowth led detectives to conclude that the victim had been killed elsewhere and then brought to the river. There were no signs of tire tracks or anything else that could help police identify the killer. With only the victim's fingerprints to work with, Sergeant John Boyd of the Decatur Police Department began trying to put a name to the Jane Doe.
And from those fingerprints, we tried a number of agencies to see if we could make an identification. We tried through here, we tried through Huntsville, and we couldn't get anything.
To expand the search, the prints were cataloged and then forwarded to the FBI, whose national fingerprint database might yield better results. In the meantime, investigators hoped an autopsy could tell them more about how this victim died. Determining the exact cause of death would be difficult. But the medical examiner did find a few faint ligature marks below where the head had been severed, indicating that the victim had been strangled before being decapitated with a dull cutting tool. The pajama top and nightgown worn by the victim were collected and forwarded to the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. There, trace evidence examiner John Kilbourne began processing the clothes for any potential clues.
We use a method that we call taping, where we take cellophane tape and using the sticky or adhesive surface of the tape, we press it down on the clothing, and what this does is collect any particles, hairs, fibers, or other particles from the surface of that clothing.
Kilbourne found a substantial number of hairs and assorted red and black synthetic fibers that had clung to the victim's clothing. Having more than 20 years' experience analyzing similar evidence from crime scenes, Kilbourne believed he knew their origin.
Some of the fibers were unusual in that the fibers had adhesive on them, some type of glue on the surface. I have had other cases similar that had fibers similar to this, and in each of these cases it turned out to be adhesive from a felt car mat in the trunk mat. And I felt like in looking at these fibers, we're looking at possibly this victim having been in the trunk of a car.
But until examiners had a source of comparison, the value of these items on their own would remain limited. 3 days later, police believed they got their first break. Fishermen had reported finding a human head floating near the shoreline. The area was less than a mile from where Jane Doe's body had been discovered.
It had been decaying, obviously, at least 3 days. It was an overwhelming stench. The head was in a severe state of decomposition. We had extreme difficulty in even picking it up to get it inside the boat. We finally had to get enough plastic bags and bag it up and put it on ice, and put it in a styrofoam cooler and put it on ice and carried it down to the forensic lab.
But prolonged exposure to the elements made it impossible for examiners to find any identifiable features. Frustrated by the lack of progress, police realized that until they could find a way to identify the decapitated woman, this case would likely remain unsolved. Police in Decatur, Alabama were making little progress in identifying a headless female victim pulled from the banks of the Tennessee River. Over the next 10 days, investigators scoured through dozens of missing persons reports in an effort to learn the victim's identity. But none matched the description of their Jane Doe. The case threatened to go unsolved. But on July 15th, they got a break. Searching through military files, the FBI found a fingerprint match with the victim. Jane Doe was identified as 32-year-old Sandra Gale Leslie, formerly enlisted in the United States Air Force. Records indicated that she currently lived in Nashville, Tennessee, 120 miles away from where she was found. Police jumped on the lead.
On that same day, after we learned who she was, we contacted Nashville Metro authorities and found out that they did in fact have a missing person report on Mrs. Leslie.
Police learned that Sandra Leslie had been reported missing by her husband 2 days after her body was discovered in Alabama. Decatur police traveled to Tennessee and teamed up with Nashville authorities. Their first visit was to Sandra Leslie's husband. 39-year-old Billy Leslie told police that his marriage to Sandra had been shaky. But he loved his wife of almost 10 years and said they were trying to work out their problems. A few days before her disappearance, the couple dropped off their 2 kids with relatives in an effort to spend more time alone together. But on the afternoon of July 4th, Billy returned home from running errands to find that Sandra and her clothes were gone.
Hello? Hey, how you doing?
He said that in the weeks before her disappearance, Sandra had received numerous unexplained phone calls. Afterward, she would often leave the house with no explanation, leaving Billy to take care of the kids. He was convinced she was having an affair, though he didn't know with whom. As a matter of routine, police asked if they could look around. Billy gave his consent. To their surprise, investigators immediately found inconsistencies with his statements.
Mark. All right.
Sergeant Robert Moore of the Nashville Police Department took part in the search.
He said she took her clothes with her. The closet was so full of clothes you couldn't put another blouse in it. There was no room for anything else. Dresser drawers, her clothes are gone, but yet every drawer was full. I mean, it just didn't look like somebody had moved out.
Though Billy couldn't explain the discrepancy, he insisted that he would never hurt his wife, and he certainly had nothing to do with her murder. He agreed to let forensic technicians process his living room. Luminol was applied to the floor. But investigators found no traces of blood or any other signs of violence. But there were indications that the residence had been thoroughly cleaned recently.
Maybe we bring the house light
Despite
on.
the lack of evidence, investigators suspected that Billy Leslie was hiding something. Police began interviewing friends and neighbors. One neighbor claimed that Billy and Sandra fought often. Just a few days before Sandra disappeared, she heard what she described as a knockdown, drag-out fight coming from outside her window. When she looked outside, she saw Billy screaming at Sandra. As the fight escalated, Billy became physically abusive toward his wife. The neighbor didn't recall seeing Sandra after that night. She just assumed Sandra had finally decided to leave Billy. Perhaps that's exactly what Billy Leslie wanted everyone to believe.
Come here, just have a
One of
seat
Sandra's
here, if you will,
friends told police that Sandra had recently filed for divorce, and as a result, Billy had become increasingly violent toward her.
I think, first of all,
So much so that just before her death, Sandra decided to change the beneficiary of her life insurance policy.
We're working with the people in Decatur, Alabama. Billy?
Prior to the change, Billy Leslie stood to gain $150,000 from Sandra's death.
She had feared for her life, and she changed the beneficiary of that insurance policy to her brother in California, and specifically asked him to make sure her children were taken care of should anything happen to her.
In the same area.
Billy wasn't informed that he was no longer the beneficiary. For investigators, a possible motive for murder was beginning to emerge. Billy Leslie, as far as he knew, had a lot to gain from his wife's death. But so far, their case was only circumstantial. Later that evening, police obtained a warrant to search Billy's car, possibly used to transport Sandra's body to Alabama. Luminol was applied to the trunk. Investigators found an overwhelming amount of substance that appeared to be blood. Billy Leslie explained he had gone fishing recently and put his catch into the trunk. The trunk mat was collected and sent back to the Decatur Crime Lab for a more thorough forensic examination. While waiting for the test results, investigators continued to build their case. Hoping to find witnesses that could put Billy near the crime scene, police released details of the murder to the media in Alabama. A few days later, the tactic paid off. A Decatur resident remembered having a conversation with a man at a convenience store a few hours before Sandra's body was discovered.
And so I gave
He had asked where to find a good fishing spot. The woman directed him to an area half a mile away. It was the same location where the victim was found.
What time of day?
She was shown a photo lineup.
Well, I was in the convenience store at 3 in the morning on Saturday.
She had no idea who the suspect on the photo lineup was, but she was able to immediately point to Billy Leslie and say, "This is the guy. This is the guy that was here," and asked me about a place to fish.
The witness testimony put Billy Leslie just a half a mile away from the crime scene on the day of the murder, and investigators had no doubt that he was responsible for his wife's death. Now, they hoped the crime lab would provide irrefutable proof. Authorities were closing in on Billy Leslie, the man they believed responsible for the decapitation of his wife, Sandra. Though their case was largely circumstantial, they hoped a trunk mat collected from the suspect's car could physically link him to the homicide. After serological tests determined that the blood found on the trunk mat was not fish blood, as Billy Leslie claimed, Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences trace analyst John Kilborn began analyzing dozens of hairs and fibers recovered from the mat. Using a comparison microscope, he began looking for common characteristics between samples from the trunk mat and those recovered from the clothes Sandra Leslie had been wearing. The color, texture, and cross-sectional shape of the fibers matched.
We found a number of fibers from the victim's clothing that were consistent to the some of the known fibers from the trunk mat, as well as some foreign fibers that were in the trunk mat. So we were able to show a link between the fibers and the hairs out of the vehicle to the victim herself.
Sandra Leslie's body had been in the trunk of that car. And the only other person known to have driven the vehicle was her husband, Billy. Billy Leslie was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Sandra. Police theorized that Billy Leslie believed he had much to gain from killing his wife before their divorce was finalized. On July 4th, 1988, after a heated argument, Billy made the decision to kill his wife. After strangling Sandra, he loaded her into the trunk of their car and set out to dispose of the body on the banks of the Tennessee River in Decatur, Alabama. Not realizing that her fingerprints were on file with the military, Billy believed that separating the head from the body would make identification impossible. In December of 1989, Billy Wayne Leslie was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Even in death, Sandra Leslie managed to leave behind clues that pointed to her killer's identity. But in some cases, investigators have no idea where the evidence will lead them. The quiet, middle-class neighborhood of Lake Grove, New York, is a haven of suburban life. The community's illusion of serenity, however, was unable to provide protection from tragedy. On April 7, 1994, police and paramedics were dispatched to the home of 47-year-old Stuart Kovacs. Kovacs said that Irene, his wife of more than 20 years, was inside, dead. He believed she had killed herself by jumping off the second-floor balcony. Not wanting to contaminate the scene, the officer allowed only one paramedic into the house. Inside, 45-year-old Irene Kovacs' lifeless body was lying on the floor, covered with a towel. Her hair was wet, indicating she had recently showered. The paramedic noted bruising on the victim and a cut lip. An empty container of gasoline additive lay nearby. A large quantity of the substance was found pooled in the victim's mouth. It appeared that Irene Kovacs had poisoned herself and then jumped or fell from the second-floor balcony. Stuart Kovacs said that while working in the garage, he cut himself on a power tool. Going inside to get a Band-Aid, he discovered his wife on the floor. Panicked, he called 911 and then went upstairs to the bedroom to get a towel to cover her and to clean up his wound. On the couple's bed, he discovered a suicide note tucked underneath the family Bible. As a matter of routine protocol, homicide investigators were dispatched to the scene. Armed with a video camera, the team made their way into the residence. Almost immediately, they were struck by the victim's appearance. Lieutenant John Girash of the Suffolk County Police Department explains.
It's somewhat unusual that a woman would want herself to be discovered not dressed. In and of itself, that is not proof of anything other than suicide, but it is one of the circumstances that we take into account as we investigate.
After removing the body, police continued examining the scene. On the second floor landing, they found a piece of recently dented sheetrock on the wall about ankle height, as though it had recently been kicked in anger, or perhaps a struggle. Unsure of its significance, the area, along with the rest of the scene, was thoroughly photographed. A short while later, after learning of his mother's death, the Kovacs' 19-year-old son came in to speak with detectives. He said that the situation at home had grown tense in recent months.
It was just, he had the probable cause to think so. He found it.
His parents' divorce was due to be finalized soon, and his dad had become increasingly abusive, often exploding into a rage over nothing. In one recent incident, Stuart Kovacs returned home early from work and confronted Irene with a note he had found that had been sent to her by a business associate. Though Irene denied any wrongdoing, Stuart accused her of having an affair and began threatening her with violence. Suffolk County homicide detective Robert Doyle.
The Kovacs children indicated to us that there was a very, very poor relationship at home, that apparently Irene Kovacs was in tremendous fear of Stu Kovacs. He abused her mentally, probably more so than physically. It was a real hellish situation to be children in that particular home.
The son added that on the night before his mother's death, she had seemed normal and happy, not at all depressed or suicidal. For investigators, the routine suicide investigation had raised more questions than answers. Irene Kovacs just didn't seem a likely candidate for suicide. Now, police realized that the circumstances surrounding this tragedy demanded a closer look. Though it appeared that 45-year-old Irene Kovacs had poisoned herself and then jumped off the second-floor balcony of her home, police in Lake Grove, New York were not convinced. A few hours after her body was discovered, police returned to the residence with a warrant. Now they were searching for evidence that Irene's husband, Stuart Kovacs, had murdered her. Forensic examiner Robert Jenna was asked to assist in the search.
The fact that we have somebody claiming that this is a suicide, the husband, and the pieces of the puzzle just don't seem to fit a suicide, you now have to focus strongly on the physical evidence to try to either show that it was in fact a suicide or show that it was in fact something other than a suicide.
To disprove the suicide story, police searched for evidence of a violent struggle. And though Kovacs blamed a deep cut to his finger on a power tool accident, police speculated it could also be explained by a blow to a sharp object, like a tooth. But traces of Stuart Kovacs' blood were found exactly where he insisted the accident took place. The search continued inside the home. In the couple's second-floor bathroom, police found traces of blood on the commode lid. A washcloth found in the sink also appeared to be blood-stained. Kovacs said the blood had come from his injured finger. Investigators collected the evidence. In the bedroom, an officer recovered the suicide note found earlier by Stuart Kovacs. Even though the writing was identified as Irene's, a close inspection of the language caught investigators' attention.
What he purported to be a suicide note was in fact some writings of Irene Kovacs that really had nothing to do with suicide at all. She was talking about her life, she was talking about various things that she was going through personally in her life. At no point did that particular note indicate or suggest that she was going to commit suicide.
Unsure what to make of the evidence, police hoped Irene herself could give them answers. The medical examiner determined the cause of death was blunt force trauma to Irene's head and chest. But he could not rule out that the injuries occurred as a result of the fall from the second floor. Blood and tissue samples were collected and forwarded to the Suffolk County Crime Lab. There, toxicologists began analyzing the samples for the presence of the alcohol methanol, the main compound used in gasoline additives like the one Irene allegedly swallowed. First, examiners analyzed Irene's blood samples by using a gas chromatograph, an apparatus that separates complex mixtures into individual compounds. The analysis of the blood confirmed that fatal amounts of methanol were present. Toxicologist Ed Briglia of the Suffolk County Crime Lab continued the analysis on the tissue samples.
Subsequent to that finding, we analyzed other specimens that we received, primarily gastric contents, intestinal contents, and esophageal contents. Those specimens revealed no methanol to be present, which was totally contrary to the notion that Mrs. Kovacs could have consumed methanol shortly before her death. The reason this is the case is that it takes a period of time, anywhere from a minimum of approximately 1 hour upwards to approximately 4 to 5 hours, for the alcohol to be removed from the stomach.
For methanol to be found in the blood but not in the tissues told examiners that the gas additive had been absorbed through Irene's skin, not ingested through her mouth. She never swallowed the gas additive. To make sense of the findings, police turned back to forensic examiner Robert Jenna. Using photographs and diagrams from the scene, Jenna found a clue. There were portions of Irene's body lying underneath the second floor landing. It was unlikely that she came to rest in that position after falling over the railing. And Stuart Kovacs claimed he never touched Irene's body. And there was something else. One of the photographs revealed that the gas additive stains on the floor formed an outline of Irene's body.
In order to get this type of pattern, the victim would have to have been lying down in this position when the material was deposited on her, as opposed to her falling from the top landing, already having the material in her system. So it was consistent with her being in this position, lying on her back, the liquid deposited on her face and body, causing this outline that led us to believe that this particular case was not a suicide, but a homicide. The outline that was
coupled with the toxicologist's findings, the evidence showed that the gas additive had been poured into Irene's mouth while she was already dead or dying on the floor. To make their case, police still needed proof of a struggle. Examiners performed DNA tests on the various blood samples collected from the couple's bathroom, believed to have been left by Stuart's cut finger. But the analysis disproved Stuart Kovacs' story. All of the blood found in the bathroom had come from Irene. That proved that she had been bleeding prior to the fall from the balcony. For investigators, it was proof that Irene Kovacs had not taken her own life. but that Stuart Kovacs had taken it from her. With a warrant in hand, police quickly tracked down Stuart Kovacs as he returned home from work. He was taken into custody and booked for murder. Investigators believe that after beating Irene as she got out of the shower, Stuart Kovacs forced her over the balcony. After pouring the gas additive into her mouth to make her death look like a suicide, he smeared blood from a cut sustained during the assault on the power tool in the garage. On December 17, 1996, Stuart Kovacs was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. Some killers will stop at nothing to conceal their crimes.
These are the...
When there are no human observers to a murder, investigators must look for a different kind of witness to reveal a killer's identity. They turn to the crime lab, where forensic examiners can uncover the truth by turning the smallest clue into a silent witness.